Picture this: a time when the world was still bound by the limitations of telegrams and typewriters, and the idea of a global network seemed like something straight out of science fiction. Yet one man, decades ahead of his time, not only imagined this future, he predicted it with uncanny accuracy. A visionary so ahead of the curve that his ideas, from the convenience of online shopping to the rise of social media, eerily mirrored the Internet we now take for granted. How did he see it coming, when most of the world had yet to even dream of it? This is the story of the inventor who foresaw the Internet a century before it arrived. If this blows your mind, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming up. In a small, quiet town, far from the bustling cities of the future, a young boy named Paul Otlet grew up surrounded by the tools of the past: pen, paper, and books. Born in 1868, Otlet had no way of knowing that he would be responsible for one of the most mind-blowing predictions in history. His world was still tethered to the traditional ways of communication and information: newspapers, physical libraries, and handwritten notes. Yet, even in his youth, he felt a pull toward something much greater than what his time could offer. Paul Otlet's story began with a deep curiosity about how the world shared information. A student of law, he initially sought to organize the chaotic world of knowledge. Little did anyone know this desire to bring order to information would lead him to conceptualize a vision so powerful that it would change the way humanity connected and communicated forever. By the early 20th century, Otlet had already begun experimenting with cataloging knowledge on a scale never before attempted. His work led to the creation of the Universal Decimal Classification, a groundbreaking system for organizing information that laid the foundation for later innovations. But Otlet wasn't just about organizing physical data. He was starting to see something far grander, something beyond the limitations of paper. In 1895, Otlet had a revolutionary idea. What if people could access information instantly from anywhere in the world? It wasn't just wishful thinking, it was a vision of the future. This idea, which would ultimately evolve into the Internet, was sparked by one man's relentless belief in the power of human connection through knowledge. And it all started with a question: how can we connect the world with information? Otlet's vision didn't emerge overnight. It took years of intense study, collaboration, and, perhaps most importantly, a belief that the world could and should be interconnected. He wasn't just a product of his time. He was someone whose mind operated in a realm beyond the present. At the heart of his ideas was the idea of a world library, where every piece of knowledge would be linked together, accessible to anyone, anywhere, at any time. But Otlet's dream wasn't something that could be realized with just a few books and a library card. He imagined a global network of knowledge, a place where information could flow freely, instantly. Picture this: a time when most people still relied on telegrams to send messages across distances, and the idea of global communication was limited to ships carrying letters across the sea. To him, this was an outdated system that needed to be replaced. His solution? The electric telescope, an early concept for a device that would allow people to access information remotely, using a system that resembled a network of interlinked files, the very concept that would one day form the basis of the Internet. But how could one man, living at the turn of the 20th century, imagine something so extraordinary? Well, Part of the answer lies in his unyielding curiosity and ability to see beyond the constraints of his era. Otlet's idea was revolutionary, but it wasn't perfect. He had the blueprint, but the technology to bring it to life didn't exist yet. In fact, it wouldn't exist for another century. Still, Otlet was unwavering, convinced that the future of information was tied to this ambitious, almost unbelievable vision. Before we can fully appreciate how radical Paul Otlet's vision was, we have to step back and understand the world he lived in, a world where the Internet was an impossibility. In the early 1900s, the technological landscape was vastly different. The idea of instant communication or a vast network of information was, frankly, unimaginable to most people. Think about it. There were no smartphones, no computers, no Wi-Fi, no Google, or even a reliable postal service to connect distant lands quickly. The world relied on printed newspapers for the latest news, and information was often shared by word of mouth or through letters that took weeks, if not months, to reach their destination. The average person couldn't dream of communicating with someone on the other side of the planet in an instant, unless they were wealthy enough to send a telegram. Otlet was living in this world of slow, cumbersome communication, but it wasn't just the lack of technology that made Otlet's vision so bold. It was the lack of imagination around how far communication could actually stretch. To most people, the idea of global access to all human knowledge was a utopian fantasy. It was simply beyond the scope of what anyone could envision. But Otlet wasn't just dreaming. He was observing the patterns of human behavior and information sharing. He saw the rise of libraries, archives, and the growing need for better systems of cataloging information. He realized that humans, regardless of location, would need a way to share knowledge in a far more interconnected way. This wasn't about books or scrolls. It was about connecting minds across the world. And this was where his genius began to emerge. He wasn't content with the status quo. He wasn't just accepting the limitations of his time. Instead, he was thinking decades, even centuries ahead, of what the world could be. And in his mind, that future was already beginning. Now that we've glimpsed the world around Paul Otlet, it's time to dive into the man himself. Who was this visionary who dared to dream of the Internet long before it was even remotely possible? To truly understand his bold predictions, we need to look at his character, his upbringing, his personality, and the influences that shaped his thinking. Otlet was born in Brussels, Belgium, into a world that was slowly moving away from old traditions. His family was well educated, and he received a law degree, but his true passion lay elsewhere, in the organization and dissemination of knowledge. His legal training would later serve him well in his systematic approach to cataloging information, but it was his relentless curiosity that pushed him to think beyond the rules of law or even science. While his peers were content with the ways things had always been, Otlet was driven by an unshakable sense that knowledge could be so much more. His thinking wasn't bound by the slow pace of his era. He lived in the world of books, but he dreamed of a digital future, a world where information was not confined to paper but could be accessed at the speed of light. Perhaps one of the most striking aspects of Otlet's personality was his collaborative nature. He didn't view his ideas as the end-all be-all of knowledge. Instead, he sought out like-minded individuals, looking to build a network of thinkers, scientists, and innovators. He even worked with a fellow visionary, Henri Lafontaine, to establish the International Institute of Bibliography, where they laid the groundwork for what would become the universal decimal classification system. Otlet's brilliance wasn't just in his ideas, it was in his ability to see the bigger picture, to understand that knowledge could be universal, and that humanity's greatest potential lay in shared information. In 1895, something remarkable happened. It was a moment in history that many at the time would have dismissed as pure fantasy. But Paul Otlet wasn't the kind of person to let reality limit his imagination. He spoke of a vision that would eventually redefine the way humanity interacts with information, a vision that eerily resembles the Internet we use today. Otlet's breakthrough moment came when he first conceptualized the electric telescope. Picture this: the ability to access knowledge not by flipping through physical pages or waiting for the slow turn of telegrams, but through a device that could connect people across distances. It was his attempt to create the first online network, even though the term online hadn't been invented yet. The electric telescope was more than just a piece of technology. It was the idea of a global information network, a kind of precursor to the World Wide Web. Imagine a world where you could look into other cultures, other countries, other fields of knowledge, all without leaving your room. A world where people didn't just exchange books, they exchanged ideas instantly. What Otlet envisioned was a system of interconnected information, a web of knowledge that could be accessed by anyone, anywhere, at any time. His concept was revolutionary, a leap of imagination that could not be fully realized until the Internet age. But for him, the idea was more than just possible. It was inevitable. For the world around him, though, the reaction was lukewarm at best. People saw it as an impossible dream, too fantastical, too far out of reach. But Otlet was resolute. He didn't need the world to believe him. He believed in his vision more than anything else. And as it turns out, he was right. Otlet's predictions weren't just about technology. They were about a whole new way of connecting the world. He didn't just foresee a place where people could share knowledge instantly. He envisioned a global community, a network that would redefine how humans interacted, how they learned, and how they connected with one another. Think about how we live today. We don't just browse the Internet for information. We use it to communicate with friends, family, and strangers on the other side of the world. We share videos, articles, experiences, building relationships through shared knowledge. Otlet's vision was strikingly similar. He predicted that the Internet would not only be a tool for accessing information, but a place where personal connections could be formed and maintained through the exchange of ideas. In 1934, Otlet went even further. He published a book that described his vision for this vast network of information, which he called the World Wide Web, long before it became a reality. Otlet also had the foresight to suggest that the network would need a way to organize information so that it could be accessed easily by anyone, regardless of their location or background. He didn't just want to connect people. He wanted to make sure that knowledge was accessible, usable, and democratized. What's even more fascinating is how Otlet's predictions weren't confined to just the academic world. He saw this network as a way to help humanity as a whole, to create a more informed and connected society, one that could make better decisions, collaborate more effectively, and overcome the limitations of geographical boundaries. In Otlet's mind, the future wasn't some distant fantasy. It was already taking shape, slowly, in the world around him. While Paul Otlet's ideas were ahead of their time, the road to recognition was anything but easy. Imagine trying to convince people in the early 20th century that a worldwide network of information was not only possible, but essential. Most people of his era were still trying to wrap their heads around telegraphs and early radio broadcasts, let alone the concept of something like the Internet. Otlet faced immense skepticism from both the public and his peers. Many of the intellectuals and inventors of his day dismissed his ideas as too abstract or unrealistic. After all, how could a system that allowed instant access to global knowledge ever be practical? How could it be built? And even if it could, would people actually use it? These were the questions that kept Otlet's contemporaries up at night, and often they were the same questions that led them to dismiss his vision outright. But Otlet was undeterred. His ideas were grounded in a firm belief that human progress could not be held back by the limits of the present. He pressed on, tirelessly advocating for his vision of a connected world. He formed collaborations with like-minded thinkers and scientists who shared his belief in the power of information. One of his major achievements was the creation of the International Institute of Bibliography in 1895, where he and others worked on systems to categorize knowledge, systems that would later inspire the creation of the Internet. Yet, despite his relentless efforts, the world wasn't ready for Otlet's bold ideas. Technology, funding, and infrastructure all stood in his way. His concept of the electric telescope remained just that, a concept, but his perseverance laid the groundwork for future generations of inventors who would take his vision and bring it to life. Otlet's road was long, but there was a pivotal moment when the world began to take notice. It wasn't just Otlet's persistence that caught attention, it was the fact that time itself seemed to catch up with his ideas. As the 20th century progressed, technology began to evolve in ways that Otlet had always predicted. Suddenly, there were machines capable of storing vast amounts of information, faster communication networks, and the early stirrings of the digital age. In the 1930s, Otlet's work started to gain a bit more traction. Some of the groundwork he laid down in the Universal Decimal Classification System and his advocacy for a networked world began to find new relevance. By the time World War II was over, the rapid advancements in computing and telecommunication were impossible to ignore. Although the Internet wasn't quite here yet, the technological advancements were heading in the direction Otlet had envisioned. His concept of the electric telescope evolved into something that resembled early computer networks. The world began to realize that the kinds of systems Otlet had imagined were no longer far-fetched dreams. They were now technological possibilities. Researchers, computer scientists, and engineers in the 1940s and 1950s started to develop tools and technologies that aligned closely with Otlet's vision. These included the first early computers, data-sharing systems, and networks that connected researchers in ways that mirrored Otlet's descriptions. Otlet, however, was largely absent from the breakthroughs that followed. He passed away in 1944, before the Internet age fully blossomed. Yet, there was a sense that the world was beginning to understand what he had foreseen all along. Information could be shared universally, and the world was about to become more connected than anyone had ever imagined. As the world moved into the mid-20th century, the unimaginable started to happen. Technology that had once seemed like science fiction was beginning to take shape. The Internet, or at least the precursors to it, was no longer a distant dream. It was becoming a tangible reality. The electric telescope that Otlet had envisioned decades earlier was beginning to form, though in ways he could never have anticipated. In the 1960s and 1970s, computer networks started to emerge. One of the first major milestones was the creation of ARPANET, a project funded by the U.S. Department of Defense, which allowed researchers to connect computers and share information. This was a breakthrough. It was the start of what would eventually become the Internet. What was even more astonishing was that the fundamental principles of ARPANET mirrored Otlet's vision, a networked world where information could flow freely across long distances. Even though Otlet didn't live to see the Internet in action, his concepts were undeniably present in the early days of computing. Researchers, engineers, and scientists who were shaping the future of the Internet were unknowingly following the blueprint that Otlet had laid out. His idea of a universal information network where knowledge could be accessed by anyone, anywhere, was coming to life in the form of digital networks. The development of technologies like the World Wide Web in the 1990s solidified the realization of Otlet's dream. Web browsers, search engines, and online services all became essential tools for people to share, access, and exchange information globally. Otlet had created a vision that was now being actively built. The gap between his futuristic ideas and the modern Internet era had finally closed, and in its place stood a revolutionary network that would change everything. Though Paul Otlet passed away before the full realization of his vision, his influence is undeniable. His ideas became a seed that would sprout into the digital revolution. And as we look at the Internet today, this vast network of interconnected knowledge, it's impossible to ignore how much of it echoes his dreams. Otlet's legacy lives on through the very tools and systems that power the Internet. Take the Universal Decimal Classification System, for example. While it may not be the go-to method for modern digital catalogs, its influence can be traced in online libraries, search engines, and the ways we organize and access digital information. Google, the Internet's most powerful search engine, relies on algorithms that, at their core, are about finding and linking related information, exactly the principle Otlet championed. But Otlet's legacy goes beyond systems and classifications. His broader vision of a connected world is now part of the fabric of our daily lives. We share knowledge in real time with people from across the globe. We access information at lightning speed, and we form global communities online. The very idea that people can engage in discussions, learn from one another, and collaborate with people they've never met, all through the power of digital networks, was once a radical dream that Otlet put forth into the world. And while Otlet may not have had the chance to see the rise of the Internet age, there are countless thinkers and innovators today who owe their work to his foresight. Without his vision, it's possible that the development of the Internet would have looked very different, or even been delayed. In a very real sense, Paul Otlet's work didn't just predict the future of technology, it shaped it. As we reflect on the extraordinary journey of Paul Otlet, it's fascinating to consider one crucial question. What if he hadn't predicted it? What if Otlet hadn't had the vision to foresee a world where knowledge was interconnected across the globe? What if he hadn't believed that information could be shared freely by anyone, anywhere? The Internet as we know it might not exist, or it might have taken a very different form. Otlet's ideas were so radical for his time that many dismissed them as pure fantasy. Without his blueprints for a global knowledge network, perhaps the concept of universal access to information would have been delayed by decades. Would the Internet have emerged as quickly as it did? Or would it have been born from someone else's vision at a later time? It's easy to imagine a world where the Internet never came to life, or at least not in the form we know it. In that world, global communication would still be bound by outdated methods, letters sent by boat, knowledge trapped in physical archives, and entire generations growing up without access to the wealth of human knowledge at their fingertips. But Otlet's foresight pushed the boundaries of what was possible. He dared to imagine a world beyond the constraints of his time, a world where information wasn't just contained in books, but could flow seamlessly between people, institutions, and nations. Thanks to Otlet, the Internet didn't just change the way we access information, it redefined how we connect, communicate, and share with one another. And perhaps, in that sense, Otlet didn't just predict the Internet, he created a foundation for a future that would radically transform society. So next time you scroll through a website or share an article with a friend across the world, think of Paul Otlet, because without his vision, none of this might have been possible.